Yes, but they did not need a lot of killing. Many were weak with starvation. Alfred seemed to consider this. Then, he turned to address his priest. Vicar, you say there is a matter of silver in the bag, Lord King. Ethelwold accuses Osric of theft of silver coins, all of which I earned, Osric insisted. Then you must yield a silver to the crown, of course, Alfred concluded. He looked across to Ethelwold. Lord Ethelwold, pray tell us the meaning of this. Ethelwold smirked as Osric threw him a dirty look. Clearly, Edward's hiding place was not so secret after all. Ethelwold was going to get her hanged. And so, uncle, Ethelwold continued, swaggering before the king. I had word that a quantity of silver had been hidden. Whose it had been before it was hidden, I do not know. He turned, and stopped walking, fixing a look of hatred on Osric, who noticed that Ethelfled looked grave, as if she were considering something. What could a young guard be doing with silver? He could never have earned it, so it stands to reason he must have stolen it. But Alfred held up a hand. And, Ethelwold pressed, but broke off again when Alfred stepped towards him. And who, pray, informed you? Now it was Ethelwold's turn to look grave. But he looked across to his cousin. Alfred knew, then, as did everyone else in the throne room. Let us see this quantity of silver, King Alfred suggested, and turned to Steeper, asking for a table. One made of oak was brought and placed in front of him by Elfgar, who looked sympathetically at Osric. A collective intake of breath filled the throne room as the king pulled the leather lace binding the top of the leather bag. Osric's heart hammered in her chest. By St. Comsil, she begged, please help me. And, even so far south that Osric could never hear the Morrigan calling her, Comsil himself of the Uineel answered. For, out of the bag, amongst a dozen wooden soldiers of Edward's army rolled the coins. 2 of them, coins of Mercia, displaying both the head of Alfred and Ceolwulf, who had reigned in Mercia as king, though really, as their lord with Alfred overseeing the Danelaw. Osric kept still, silent, noticing however, from the corner of her eye Edward's face break into a wide smile, half turned to his sister in triumph. Ealhfled scowled, and glared at her brother. Osric said nothing, though she was sure her face must have betrayed her shock. Alfred said nothing for a moment, though his neck flared pink. Was it embarrassment at calling the court to hear of theft, when the truth was somewhat different? He picked up the 2 pieces of money, held them out in his own hand. I will not deprive you of these, the King of Wessex concluded. A guard is more in need of 2 silver pieces than the church, to whom all of this quantity. He glared across to Ethelwold, who was still standing beside the king, arms folded, and snorted in derision at the king doubting him, despite the evidence, where this silver was destined. Come. He gestured for Osric to hold out a hand and let both of the coins fall into them. Beside his father, Edward reached out for his wooden army. But the king was still looking at Osric, who had folded her hands around the 2 silver pieces. You will make confession to Father Booker. I know you attend matins when you feel it can leave my son, and I know that you cover your duty, very conscientious. May I pass on my gratitude, Osric the Gael? Ethelwold was angry, clearly, and he glowered at her for making him look stupid in front of the court, as she followed Booker to the chapel. Though, how she actually had managed that, for there was 100 times more silver in that bag than was there, was not clear at all until she was walking with Edward that afternoon, following his sword practice. It was clear he must have something to do with it, and she bent closer to the Atheling, as a warm, summer breeze blew languidly around them. I heard Ethelfled, my sister, tell Ethelwold you had money hidden here, so I put in more of soldiers, to fool them, and hid your silver for you. It worked. Osric stopped walking, and crouched down a little, so she was face to face with Edward. She beamed. It did work, Lord Prince. I am so grateful to you. May you tell me where? But Edward shook his head. It is hidden, Osric, Edward hissed back. And, if you don't know where, no one can make you tell them. And Osric could not fault his logic, as well as his bravery and kindness. 88,888,888. So, this silver? Elfrith had persuaded her to the 2 cranes. Thankfully, Elfber seemed not to be working at the bar that evening, which left her gossipy friend to do just that. I hid what I brought me when I was first in Winchester. When I eventually leave, I will take it with me. You're leaving? A slim, long-limbed girl was bringing ale. Osrith shook her head, while Elfrith waved her on to fill up his tankard, pressing a coin into her hand, lingering his own, and waiting for her reaction, which he duly received, as she simpered at him. Osrith rolled her eyes. And to think, he challenged me over Elfberg. And it's yours? Elfrith asked, doubtfully. I rescued it from a boat that would have otherwise sunk. So bride's, when she escaped from Bibbenberg. I have no doubt it had been stolen before. Elfrith leaned forward. The armory, he hissed. Wherever your silver is hidden, move it to the hiding place I'll show you. Tomorrow. I use it when I'm hiding my extra pay from my wife. You are free to use it. Thank you. But, thanks to Prince Edward's sleight of hand, my silver is already hidden. I just don't know where. It was mostly true, but didn't account for the meager amount she had left over from her journey with Alf and Gert, or the money she had managed to get out of the thatch from her brother's house the first time round. You have a wife? Osrich asked, in astonishment. Elfrith laughed, then sipped his ale. I owe money, so I tutor a bit on the side. My wife is one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, but we cannot be together properly until I am out of debt and out of Ottawa Servide, which I am now, thanks to you. To me? Osrith repeated, as her heart sank. Uhtred, followed by his closest man Finan, and others who served him. Not after today, Osrith complained, in her head. He was bound to come over and challenge her over Elfberg again. Wasn't he? Cittric or Finan might finally recognize her as the person he had pursued from Uhtred's house. She dragged her eyes back to Elfrith. Otto and Alfred rearranged their staff. I am one step closer to Eadgith now, being in Winchester. So he leaned towards her. Good, thought Osrith. It kept her out of view of Uhtred. So, what happened? Ethelwold, Osrith replied, in disgust. He keeps jumping on me, or pretending to attack Edward, so of course, I have to fight him. But Elfrith interrupted her. He's a lazy good-for-nothing, always wanting to proclaim he is the real king of Wessex. I mean, the Danes would be over the kingdom like a shot, if he were in charge. That's why he is being kept by Alfred, to make sure he stays drunk and niggardly, so he doesn't get ideas about teaming up with them. I could slit his throat in the night, and do everyone a favor. Osrith growled, sullenly, sipping at her own ale. He could slit your balls off in the day, Elfrith replied. Don't make an enemy of Ethelwold, you will lose. But Osrith did not reply. Instead she got to her feet. Is there another alehouse we can do to? She asked, suddenly. Cittric was getting up and, after the day she had had, Osrith did not want an altercation with anyone. Alehouse, or chapel. Her destination was irrelevant now, for she was already striding across the 2 cranes' dirt floor, hand on buoy as she fixed her eyes on the door. There's the swan with 2 necks, Elfrith called after her, waylaid a little by the whore who had served him the ale. He stumbled past 2 other guards, catching up with her just outside. The swan? He asked again. Chapel, Osrith replied, pacing away from Elfrith. Thank you for the evening, my friend, she added. I did not wish to remain to have yet another reason for the king to summon me before him. What? Osrith jerked her head behind them. They were being followed. I'll come with you, Elfrith chipped in, and they nodded their way through the palace gates. Not that I do not like church, Osrith told herself, but 3 times in one day, Uhtred, or Cittric, or Finan, or the new guard who looks like a baby monk, but carries an axe, none of them could attack her in the chapel. Elfrith left her kneeling at the altar as one of the novices recited the gospel. The moon had risen and the sun had finally sunk when they had got there, and when Elfrith had decided to go, he was aware that it was well on the way to being morning. He was also aware that Osrith was speaking quietly to herself in Gaelish. However, Elfrith was wrong. She was not merely speaking, but praying. At the back of the chapel, Someone who understood the words listened. When she had finished, Osrith made her way towards the outer corridor which flanked the inner garden courtyard. It was at this point a hand reached for her shoulder. They were no longer inside the chapel. Osrith reached for tagged Sikhs. The tall warrior of her brother, close-cropped black hair and curiously vulnerable demeanor, looked at her face. Finan. Osrith stepped away. Jamaat Sahib. But Osrith glared at him. Gab Mola's jewel. She shouted back, then stalked furiously back to Edward's room, to sleep outside it until dawn. 8,888,888. A week before the party from Elsburg, capital of Mercia, were due, Ethelflaed's betrothed, soon-to-be husband Ethelred amongst them. The firstborn child of Alfred was holding high above her head a wooden sword which she had taken off him. Edward was not tall enough to retrieve it and was jumping up in uncharacteristic rage at his sister, who was laughing cruelly at him. Osrith was just coming back from the kitchens and her dinner when she found them, demanding that the princess show kindness to her brother. "You can't tell me what to do. I am to be the lady of the Mersons." Ethelflaed was almost her age, perhaps a year younger. So, why did it give her so much pleasure to annoy her younger brother? Of course, Osrith agreed. A lady should see that is no way to behave to someone in a weak position to herself. Edward grinned, and stepped back from his sister. "He took my necklace," Ethelflaed complained, still holding Edward's sword out of reach. Wheeling round, Osrith bore down on the boy. "Is this true?" She was astonished when he nodded. "I was going to put it back," he said, meekly, holding the gold and emerald necklace out towards Osrith. "See how pretty it looks in the sun." But Osrith did not smile, or look. Instead, she folded her arms. "Give it back to your sister, Edward," Osrith said, sternly. A look of misplaced martyrdom settled on Ethelflaed's features. "You had no right to take it." Edward looked downcast and Osrith had to do all she could not to comfort him, for it was he who was in the wrong, not Ethelflaed, who seized the necklace with glee, and walked gleefully away, a bounce in her step. "You can't just take your sister's things, no matter if you were going to return them," Osrith told him later. "What does the Bible say about theft?" Edward looked at her, blankly. "So, I have no choice but to tell your father." "No, don't do that," Edward exclaimed, horrified. "He will beat me." "Yes," agreed Osrith, sternly, and got up to go. But Edward hung his head. "What is it?" she said, sitting beside him. "The punishment will hurt," Osrith conceded, "but it will be over quickly." "I do not fear a beating," Edward said, into his lap, hands covering his face. "I am just sorry about the necklace. I wanted to give it to someone." Osrith's mind flicked to the kitchen maid who he smiked at when he went to his tutor. She was tiny and pretty, with a mass of dark, curly hair whose pale face pinked when she caught his eye. A Briton, perhaps, like Haf, and wholly unsuitable a future king. He had to make a dynastic match, not follow his heart. Osburh would be in a deal of trouble accepting Lady Ethelflaed's necklace, Osrith counselled. He turned his head, eyes shining. Then, he placed his hand over hers. "And you, would you be in a deal of trouble?" Osrith felt her heart sink. "You stole this for me?" Osrith asked, in amazement. Edward hung his head lower, withdrawing his hand as quickly as he had touched her own. "You said you need your silver to stay alive, so you can't buy yourself a necklace." "Oh, Edward," Osrith exclaimed, pulling him to her, "that is so very thoughtful of you." But then a thought struck her and she got to her feet, quickly. "How did you know I was not a man?" "The night I followed you," Edward recounted. "You went for piss." "I would have been crouching," Osrith thought. "I have not kept it a secret. But it is not good for me for this to be well known. So I thought, the necklace." Edward's voice trailed off. "But it is wrong to take your sister's things," Osrith chided him. "I wish you were my sister," he said, suddenly, getting to his feet. "I wish Ethelflaed were." "Enough." Osrith took a step backwards, and then knelt before him. "I am your warrior, Etheling Edward, and, I hope, your friend. Besides, what would I do with a pretty necklace?" "Wear a pretty dress, comb out your hair," Edward began, but she shushed him, touched at his kindness. "I appreciate that you want rich things for me. It shows you value my friendship." And then she strode to the door, holding it open. "I will not tell your father why you stole the necklace when you admit it to him," Osric concluded, "but do not take from your sister again." An hour later, Osric was made to watch as Steep landed 5 blows across the Etheling's back. The Lady Elswith looked as if she was going to murder the head of her husband's guard as her son whimpered on the final stroke. From the corner of the courtyard, Ethelwold watched, with interest. Edward had not grown up as street children did, running day and night, learning dirty tricks and even dirtier defenses. Steeper hardly touched him, but it was enough. And it was as if that moment changed him. Edward was more focused in his fighting lessons, more focused on his learning. "That him, the little bastard!" Cithric shouted, for he had been spurned by Elfber again. It was a sunny, late July morning, and she was being heckled by Uted's men, who clearly had nothing better to do. Osric kept silent, but drew Edward's lesson to a close. They had had word the mercenaries were coming that day and preparations were being made. "Lord Uted," Osric acknowledged, but did not bow her head. Standing next to him just for that moment, Osric used all her willpower not to turn back to him. It was the first time she had spoken directly to her brother in the 3 months she had landed in Winchester, and it unnerved her how deeply the words she had nurtured in her heart were making her feel. She swallowed hard, swallowing her weak emotion away as she marched with Edward towards his father's scriptorium. Ethelwold leaned against a rompoiler of the palace, biting down into an apple. He already had a flagon of ale in his hand. Uted rolled his eyes. "I still say he wants my Elfberg," fumed Cithric, falling silent under Uted's glare. But Ethelwold was laughing. "What?" Uted demanded. "What?" repeated Ethelwold, ambling lazily towards him. "What's so funny?" clarified Finan, his eye following Osric's wake. "He," Ethelwold replied, poking a finger at Cithric, who frowned. "You," said he. "Yeah?" So Cithric could feel himself getting angry. "That woman you love, Cithric Chartanson, my cousin's guard, cannot be after the woman you pursue, Cithric. He cannot be." Ethelwold was enjoying himself. Uted stamped 2 steps over to him. Ethelwold was chastened enough to stop grinning. "And why is this?" "That boy," Ethelwold laughed, "is no boy." "No boy," Uted repeated. "He is a girl." Ethelwold threw the core of his apple in the direction of the scriptorium, laughing at their disbelieving features. "Do you believe it, Clapper?" Uted demanded of his largest warrior, who shook his head. "How can you tell?" Osferth ventured, as the doors of the palace were flung open for the emissaries from Mercia. "I have a lot of experience in that department, Osferth, my bastard cousin," Ethelwold replied, draining his ale. "And she is going into the palace, where I live," he concluded, "and sleeps, on guard, outside Edward's room." He smirked. "This information has only recently come to me, so I will now be able to conduct an intimate study. Probe into the matter deeply." He rearranged his genitals, and inhaled sharply. "You should leave her be," Uted warned. "If that guard really is a girl, which I doubt, he may have reasons for a disguise." Or, Finan taunted, he could be a boy lover. "Those are always very strange." "But, if you find out, be sure to come and tell us, Ethelwold." He laughed. "Alfred, by his church, would not like it," Uted mock warned. "And I tell you, that guard of Edward's is no girl. I have seen him fight." "Are you being addicted to young boys, Ethelwold, like Osric, that mercenary warrior of Ethelred's?" Ethelwold snorted. At the implied insult, he strode past them, heading along the path to the scriptorium. Then, just as the mercenary party turned the corner of the palace's garden, turned, mimed 2 breasts with his hands over his own chest, then thrust his crotch in its direction. 88,888,888. That night, as he lay in the darkness, his hand down his breeches, Ethelwold thought of his cousin Edward's new guard. His hand went readily to his cock as he thought of undressing her, willingly or unwillingly. As long as she was naked he didn't care. He ran his tight-cupped hand up his cock, rounding it over the hot tip as he thought of his hands on her firm thighs, on her waist, her breasts, his mouth on her teats, sucking at the small, shy nubs he supposed she had, coaxing into big, red points. Unwilling had a certain edge to it, and he rubbed himself more at the thought of her writhing. Wrists and ankles chafed sore as she fought her bonds. What could he done to blackmail her? To make her come to his room, defiant but choiceless, as he plunged into her as deep as he could, his balls straining at the pressure of the fluid build-up. No, not a boy, he thought, as he heard footsteps. Osrith was passing by on her usual guard of Edward. He would have to find something with which he could blackmail her with. It would have to be significant or she would fight him and protest. She was clever. He did like it when they struggled helplessly beneath him. The novice nun he had had only last week had been determined to escape him. Oh, how he had enjoyed gagging her and tying her down, arms wide displaying her large, rounded, vulnerable breasts, her legs wide apart, cunt on display, helpless. How he had enjoyed the expression of horror on her face as he did the inevitable. She had been very tight and it hadn't taken him long. What else did she expect when he chanced on her somewhere she shouldn't have been, looking at the novice monks in the scriptorium, hand between her legs? He'd thanked her, afterwards, when he finally let her go. She should have been grateful. And this warrior girl would he the same, all fight, all chase, all fury as he found her cunt and maneuvered her into a good position to ram himself satisfyingly into her tight little opening. Wank wank wank. Ethelwold's hand moved, building up his rhythm with a delightful amount of friction as his pre-cum squelched between his fingers. He had tried blackmail the same novice before, too, taking apples from the monastery garden for herself. But she had had too many alibis then, she was laundering at the time, and if he had gone to the abbess his lies would have been exposed. She had smirked at him. But this time. Wank. Wank. Poor thing. Yet if she had gone to him under blackmail, there would have been no need to tie her down. It would be as if she had accepted him willingly, curled her legs around his back that he could thrust more deeply into her, throwing her head back so she got her pleasure too. To have tits wobbling before him, nipples all taut from his attention to her outstretched body. All the while her body making it increasingly easy to enter her. There was as much power in skillful management of a woman's body as in forcing an unwilling lover. More, perhaps. Ethelwold sighed as his pleasure built, thinking of a woman attending him willingly. It had been so long he couldn't even remember. But Ethelwold could not think for long as his body took over, the rush of orgasm overcoming him as his thick semen oozed down his cock, around his balls and over his curly ginger mound, as he moved his hand firmly on his cock still, through his viscous cum, to finish off his wank and feel the waning pulses of pleasure. Of course Edward's guard was no boy. How good it would feel when she was under him. Ethelwold lay back as he fantasized as to how he could blackmail her. How many people thought she was a boy? What was her secret that made her lie? Where was that silver that he had seen her and Edward hide? And Ethelwold's mind twisted around a plan, in the darkness, post-ejaculation. It needed to be well planned and set up, and, by manipulating 2 or 3 people he knew just how he would do it. Who knows, Ethelwold told himself as Osrith's feet passed outside his door again. She might be under him within a month.